Okay, so welcome and thank everyone for coming here tonight and spending some time this evening listening and learning together. As we explore the topic of widening the frame, our dialogue and presentation will explore the history and complex dynamics of the current conflict in the Middle East. Our presenter this evening is Dr. David Takitaki. Dr. Takitaki is an adjunct instructor of social and behavioral sciences here at Ferris State University, specializing in political science. He's a dedicated educator and research with a focus on higher education, American politics, and international relations. Known for his engaging teaching style and commitment to student success, Dr. Takitaki integrates real-world applications into his coursework. Beyond the classroom, he serves as coordinator for the Political Engagement Project and actively supports learning opportunities for students and community members, reflecting on his passion for fostering learning both inside and outside the academic setting. Please join me in welcoming David Takitaki here this evening.
Thank you very much. All right, I think my mic is working. Everyone can hear me, yes? Fantastic. So we're approaching a difficult topic this evening, and I don't want to pretend like it's not. I'm going to be giving you information that not only stems back thousands of years, but was current as of this morning. And what that means for us is that there's a lot to cover. But it's not just time and history and volume of information that we really need to address. We also realistically need to address some very heavy and difficult to discuss issues. If you've been following what's been going on in the Middle East, what's been going on since October 7th, 2023, what's been going on within the context of Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, then you have some idea that we're dealing with issues that for many people are life and death. It's also an incredibly polarizing issue because it's a complicated one. And it is very easy for us as citizens of the world, to find ourselves wondering who we can believe. Moreover, it's very common for us to find ourselves locked into a system of beliefs in which we can no longer take anything we hear about perhaps the other side seriously. And if you come into this room with that, I don't blame you for it. I may push back on it over the course of this presentation. But one of the fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves is, if someone says, I am engaging in this for the benefit of my people and because we have been wronged, and they have a long history that supports that narrative, what do you think about that? And conversely, if the people whom are on the opposite side of a violent and awful conflict with them present the exact same argument with a similarly long and detailed list of historical grievances, what does that mean for you? What does that change, if anything? Many people like to say that this is just an issue about land, or it's just about religion, or it's just about terrorism, or it's just about conquest. It's all of those things, not just one of them. And understand that we have an innate and intrinsic desire as people to make things as simple and as easy as possible, right? If a massive, complicated, lethal issue can be dismissed by adding 1 + 1 equaling 2 and moving on, that is it's a deeply desirable outcome for us as people, right? Also, we have our own desires to hear what we think to be right or good bounced back at us. And sometimes it's not that simple. Realistically, most times it's not that simple. And I'm laying this out because this issue, this conflict, these people are incredibly complex. And it is a life or death situation. And if you're going to walk away with enough actual understanding by which you can form an educated opinion on this issue, you have to be ready to hear things that maybe don't line up with what you already understand. I get new information on a daily basis that contradicts maybe what I thought about that issue or this issue earlier in the day. And good scholarship, good science, good citizenship requires that we be prepared to reassess what we think we understand. And it also means we have to listen to people, because this is a multi-factor scenario. Yes, as I mentioned, religion is a factor. Depending on how you define them, things like ethnicity and race may be a factor in how the lines of this actual now battle are drawn. We have to ask ourselves, what is a nation? Is it an idea like the Red Sox nation, or is it a country with physical boundaries, geography, and actual sovereignty, legitimacy across the country? Is that the difference between a nation and a nation state? What about governments? What makes a government legitimate? Is it that it was once accepted by its people, that it's currently accepted by the people? Is it that it's working in the people's best interest? All of these questions form many parts of the debate that we'll be talking about over the course of the next hour to hour and 30 minutes. Now, all of that is, in fact, set up, right? Before we can begin getting into background. And the background of this issue is not only, as I mentioned previously, thousands of years old, but it involves one of the most basic and fundamental human desires: safety. There are no shortage of Hollywood movies that are made based off of our desire to be able to stand up for ourselves when we're threatened, right? You know, bad guys come and they invade your neighborhood, or they kick down your door, and there's a great deal of fantasy and wish fulfillment in the idea that we can stand up to them and we can, beat back the bad guys and we can be successful. We want to be safe, and we want to feel like we are empowered to be safe. And that's not unique to us as Americans. It's not unique to any one group of people. It doesn't matter if you're young or old, or a man or a woman, or what religion you follow. Safety is a fundamental human concern. And if your safety is threatened, well, those movies give us some of the same things. What would you do to be safe, right? If somebody comes after your daughter, isn't that the Liam Neeson thing, right? I will find you. We will do a lot to be safe. And yet all of those movies tend to flirt with the idea that at some point in time, despite the legitimate grievance and the inciting incident of our hero, right? There comes a point where maybe they cross that line. And it's not just about being safe anymore. Maybe now it's about getting the bad guys. Maybe now it's about payback. And we need to understand that line and the inclinations towards it if we're going to appreciate what this conflict is and has become. This land has been contested throughout the entirety of human history. Now, this specifically refers to the area in and around Jerusalem. But if you want to go back to approximately 3500 BC, you will find communities of what are known as Jebusites. We have some archaeological record of the individuals who inhabited the area at that time. Those would eventually give way to the Jewish kingdoms, which would be followed by the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Hasmoneans, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Persians, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Crusaders, later Arabs under Saladin. I actually discovered not that long ago that the Mongols actually held Jerusalem for about 4 months in 1300 AD, eventually transitioning the Ottomans into the British Empire. Because this history means that there are a lot of people who at one point in time or another throughout the course of this continued conflict could lay some measure of a claim to the lands that we today would refer to as Israel and Palestine. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves is a claim that was 2,000 years old, therefore technically predating the claim of someone who is making a different claim, more or less valid than the claim of someone who has controlled the land for the last 500 years? Right? Which claim is more valid? We were here 2,000 years ago. We were here for 500 years and we got pushed out. We've been trying to get back for the last 1,500. Yeah, well, we've been here for the last 500 years. And if that number 500 years seems like it maybe is less than the whole 2000 year claim in terms of its history or its validity, remember that the United States has only been a country for what, 250, right? So if we are going to say those historical elements take precedence, then maybe we need to take a strong look at what land we're standing on. And if we're going to say that only the current elements have precedence, then maybe we need to take a look at, the way that the rest of human history has unfurled, because does that suggest that, whoever was there in the very, very beginning should revert? We should all go home? Is that fair to somebody in this country whose family's owned land since the Pilgrims arrived and have spent, 12 generations, I don't know, raising apples? If that sounds complicated, if it sounds like it's hard to find a fair answer to that kind of question, congratulations, you've begun to wrap your head around one of the core issues in this. And here, I've highlighted the British Empire. And I've done so for a reason, because after World War I and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire found themselves in functional control over the territory that we now consider to be Israel and Palestine. There's actually a great deal more territory that they found themselves in control of. And the British were very interested in winning the war. They were very interested in being victorious over the Ottomans. And that made them make some promises that they, as many colonial powers have in the past, would eventually break. Between 1915 and 1916, Foreign Minister McMahon from within the United Kingdom engaged in correspondence with significant Arab leaders, specifically Hussein. And the deal made by McMahon at the time was that there would be an exchange if the Arab population would rise up against the Ottomans and fight alongside the British people. They would gain control of the area post-war. And the Arabs were interested in autonomy at this point. While they had not lived horrible lives under the Ottomans, there's a difference between true self-determination and being part of an empire that you do not control. And the Arabs were as good as their word. They rose up and fought against the Ottomans in the theater. If you've ever seen the movies Lawrence of Arabia, chronicling T.E. Lawrence, this essentially was part of the British campaign with Arab allies against the Ottomans in World War I. Unfortunately, for world history, at the exact same time this was occurring, we also see individuals within the United Kingdom who are actively petitioning the British government for what is a completely justified request. And the request was, can you help us? Now, who's making that request? It's the Jewish community. It's the Jewish community in the United Kingdom. And while we are still a few years away from one of the most crystallizing anti-Semitic events in the 20th century, it's important for us to understand that as of 1917, the Jewish people, the Semitic peoples in and around Europe have endured centuries of oppression and violence. My wife and I had the incredible good fortune to spend a week, a little bit more than a week actually, in the city of Budapest in Hungary. It's a gorgeous city. It's a phenomenal piece of history. And on one of our first nights there, we found ourselves walking through an area of the city that was referred to at the time as the Jewish Quarter, and it still is. And there's an incredible temple there, and there's some really, really cool things. And only after getting back to the place where we were staying did I stop to think about the fact that if you look at a map of Budapest, one of the reasons that area is called the Jewish Quarter is that it was outside the protective walls of the city. because Jews weren't allowed to live inside the city, because they were actively oppressed. And when you have that kind of inequality stamped into the flagstones of major cities all over Europe, I hope that serves as a brief reminder of some of the struggles of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism ran rampant through large parts of Europe. Exclusionary practices, limitations on employment, limitations on residency, violence. And so the idea that the Jewish community, even in 1917, might be asking the British Empire for assistance, for help in finding a home, for some access to what they would refer to eventually as Zion, should not surprise anyone. These are oppressed and marginalized people seeking a place of safety. And as it happens, this effort, this political and completely justified hope on the part of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom is also successful. And it happens because in 1916, there is a change. Prime Minister Asquith is no longer the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Prime Minister George becomes the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And we see something in 1917 called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is a political statement by the British Empire in support of the establishment of a Jewish homeland in and around what today is Israel-Palestine. Now, that's the opinion of one country, right? It's not as if that is a global opinion, but it also happens to be an opinion of one of the countries who take over the territory and are controlling it under mandate after the end of World War I. And so what we end up seeing as a result of that is a significant increase in the population of Jewish immigrants between 1917 and 1947. Between that period of time. Because in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration, the population in the area is between 10 and 13% Jewish. By the time we get to 1947 and the end of the war, it's going to be between 31 and 33% Jewish. But understand what that means. That means that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the British Empire was supporting granting significant territorial and land control to a group of people that were an 87% minority in the territory. 10 to 13% Jewish, 87 to 90% Arab, Muslim, some Christians as well, some Druze. But a fractional minority of the people living in the area at the time. And then, of course, history happens. Because while there was some immigration in between 1917 and the late 1930s, those who could escape the horrors of the Holocaust frequently hoped to be able to set up in what would eventually become known as Israel, and certainly was known then as the Holocaust. I'm not able in this brief period of time to recount to any realistic, respectful amount the horrors of the Holocaust. Millions of people murdered because of their religious faith. And maybe just as prescient to history, decades functionally of oppression, marginalization, blaming, scapegoating, heaped upon them before. Human beings being placed in ghettos. Years of suffering and starvation. And it should not surprise anyone that in the aftermath of that horror, the world was ready to do something to try to help the Jewish people. And this is a good time for us to remind ourselves, right, that we are dealing with numerous and distinct labels in this exercise. Because if we're talking about the Jewish people, we are generally talking about those of the Jewish faith. Some people will consider themselves Jewish by ancestry. Some people will consider themselves Arab. There are Arab Jews. If Arab is a racial identity and Jewish is a faith, right? You can be Muslim. You can be Christian. You can consider yourself North African or Egyptian. You consider yourself Lebanese or Syrian as a national identity. And if we layer all these things on top of each other, it actually gets really complicated. I, over the course of this presentation, will almost certainly at some point in time say the Jewish people when I really mean to say the Israeli government, right? It's hard to keep it straight. I will almost certainly say something about Hamas, or I'll say something about Arab people when I'm actually talking about Muslim people. And I'll try to catch myself, but understand these are actually very different things. And as we proceed, we cannot let ourselves presume that Hamas speaks for everyone who is Arab or Muslim, or that the Israeli government speaks for everyone who is Jewish. These are different things. But it is largely religious Judaism, though also some inappropriately kind of contrived racial conception of Judaism that motivates much of the Holocaust. And in the aftermath of that, we finally see some international desire to make a change. And by 1947, this is what the area in and around Israel starts to look like. There are two different colors of orange on this map. The darker orange that you see is where the Jewish population has settled. And mind you, as of 1947, this is about 30-ish% of the population. The lighter color orange is largely Palestinian land. A lot of it is uninhabited land in the south, in the center of the country, because at that time, it's not particularly suitable for crops or domestic cultivation. But this is what this looks like in 1947. And as I mentioned, the world has a desire to do something about the persecution and destruction that the Jewish people have felt. And so the fledgling United Nations comes together and they decide maybe what we need to do is we need to create a Jewish homeland and an Arab Muslim homeland. And if you look at the previous map and see where Jewish land ownership was, you can kind of see why the blue areas here are more sensible to fall under some kind of Jewish control. The red areas on this map would then fall under Arab or eventually Palestinian control. And the idea was this was going to be a two-state solution. We're going to make two countries here. These fiddly little border pieces through here, right, were designed so that there could be contiguous elements of the country, despite the strange arrangement of land. And the fledgling United Nations passed this partition plan by a vote of 33 votes in favor, 10 abstentions, and 13 votes against. The 33 votes in favor were pretty much most of the Western world, including most of Europe. The 10 abstentions, many of which were countries in the global south and people who were disinterested. The 13 votes in opposition were pretty much every Arab and Middle Eastern country. And so as we look at this partition plan, it does to some extent make sense. If you are someone who is attempting to find a homeland for the Jewish people, respect the existing distribution of the Jewish population throughout this area of the world and create something that maybe gives different groups of people some measure of political control in contiguous states, you can kind of see how maybe they came up with this. It was not the only location proposed, right, for a potential Jewish homeland in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Certainly the one that was most frequently desired by many people within the Jewish community. But there was talk about maybe moving them elsewhere, finding, areas in Africa. I think it's mostly apocryphal at this point in time, but I know at one point in time I had heard that someone had suggested the Upper Peninsula of Michigan as a potential location for such a homeland, right? It'd be in between two different major allied nation states, lots of mineral resources, access to international seaways, that could make sense too. But this is what the United Nations decided on. You'll notice that there's a big yellow blob in the middle of that. And that's because it was seen at the time, and realistically is still seen today, that surrendering control of Jerusalem for either faction was a deal breaker. And as a result, the 1947 UN partition plan tried to say, well, what we will do is Jerusalem will be an international city. It will be its own thing. And we will have councils within it that have both Jewish individuals and Muslim individuals and Christian individuals, right? And they will run the city and it will be open to everyone. And that was what the partition was supposed to do. But after this vote occurred, after you had this vote in which all of the local nations effectively said, I don't support this and I will not be a part of it, a couple of things start happening. And the first thing is the UN starts backing away from this because they don't want to be seen as someone who's going to impose this upon a population that does not want it. The other thing that happens that's very important is that the Jewish settlers in the region begin preparing because their fear is that in the aftermath of this, there's going to be violence. There's going to be some kind of a conflict. And they need to defend themselves. They need to build up their own defenses. And this is where that line starts to emerge. Because given their history of persecution, given what's happened to them just within the last few years, as a religion, and frequently as individuals, right? The fear that there could be a reprisal from local Arab and Muslim peoples to prevent them from settling, to get rid of them, to engage in something else that looks like the Holocaust, was real. And so they began training and preparing to resist any potential incursion from the surrounding states. And there was fighting that occurred during this period of time. But what quickly began to happen is the initial plans for self-defense in terms of resisting attackers turned into a plan to establish a homeland regardless of who was there at the time. And that unfortunately leads to an event that we refer to today as the Nakba. Now, the Nakba, in terms of the Arabic language, means catastrophe. And for the Palestinian people, this is the seminal event that sets up the next 75, nearly 100 years now of their history. Now remember, previously, the plan had been for Jewish individuals and Jewish settlers to defend themselves against potential incursion. But by March of 1948, that becomes offense. And what they're effectively doing is they are attempting to secure land for themselves. Yes, out of concern that they will eventually suffer attacks, but also out of desire to control land for themselves, to establish the homeland, which they have always been denied. And in those attacks, 13,000 local Palestinians are killed, and 750,000 people, about 80% of the population at the time, are displaced from their homes. They are pushed out of the area. Now, a tremendous number of them would go on to settle across the River Jordan in refugee camps. Some would go into Egypt, some would leave the area altogether, some would actually end up in Lebanon and in Syria. Many of them are still there. The refugee camps that come about as a result of the Nakba, this 1948 displacement of the Palestinian people, have remained and are still there today. Now, there have been arguments for and against as to why those camps are still there. Many say that the people within them could have been transitioned into other nationalities previous to this point. Others say that they are simply holding out hope because what they desperately want is the right of return, the chance to go home again to the lands that they lost in 1948. I will not pretend to know what's in the head of somebody who's spent now probably 3 generations in a refugee camp. But there are obviously humanitarian concerns. In May of 1948, Israel functionally declares its independence. And in the aftermath of that declaration, the Arab nations surrounding it join the conflict. And that ends up being very determinate because, with support from the West and Western allies, Israel wins that war. And they win it pretty handily. Let me move forward here a little bit. So we can see what it looked like in 1917, where you had spatterings of Jewish settlers who had moved into the area. In 1948, the aftermath of that war, what we end up having is we have the Palestinian population and Palestinian territorial control limited to 2 areas. There is a large swath of land that sits on the west bank of the Jordan River, which is that kidney-shaped green space in that 1948 space. That is the West Bank. There is also a tiny strip of land that exists along the ocean, technically the sea. And that strip of land is the area that was in and around the heavily urbanized city of Gaza. That is the Gaza Strip. And for a good chunk of most of our lifetimes, all of mine, this has been the way in which Israel and Palestine existed as political states, right? Israel was the entire remainder of the territory, and Palestine was the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. During the war in 1967, which you can argue was provoked by Arab outsiders, Israel was again victorious, and from that moment forward, realistically had political control over both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They were able to impose laws. They were able to set structures. And by the time we get into the early 90s here, what you have is an increasing encroachment of, specifically in the West Bank, Israeli settlers moving in and breaking up Palestinian control in the West Bank. And what's important to recognize about that is this is not an accident. This is part of a strategy to continue taking territory. And we have to put a pin in that for just a moment, right? Because remember, at this time, Israel is still surrounded by hostile neighbors. We have seen the rise of militant Islamicism throughout large chunks of the Middle East. And we've seen Israel become, in many ways, a significant enemy for almost all of those groups. And if you are someone who is part of the Israeli government, or you're a Jewish citizen within Israel itself, you may look at that and go, we need security. We need ways to protect ourselves. And if you are a Palestinian who has lived in West Bank for years and years and years peacefully, and the IDF comes along and bulldozes your house so that it can be a safe zone for an Israeli settlement they're building on the hill next door, those arguments don't sound all that valid. Now, the flip side, if you are an Israeli citizen who's never really wished any harm on anyone, and you get the phone call one day that a suicide bomber killed 2 of your loved ones in a pizza place, you might not be too concerned about the plight of the Palestinians in that one. And that is hard to deal with. Remember the question we asked, what would you do for safety? What would you do? And in this case, as an objective observation, it is the position of the nation state of Israel, not the Jewish people, not individual citizens, but the political policy of the nation state of Israel has been to place settlements in the West Bank and divide up and displace the Palestinian people. And that has consequences, because what it looks like today is this. What we see here is the current state of land control in and around the West Bank. Now, the areas in dark brown are the areas that are exclusively controlled by Palestinians, or at least previous to October 7th, 2023 had exclusive control from Palestinians. The areas in lighter, kind of a yellow, are joint Palestinian and Israeli civil control. All the areas in white are exclusively controlled by Israel. And if you can see all the little blue dots that are spread throughout this map, all of the blue dots, and notice they extend from the south all the way to the north. Those dots are the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And what you need to know about those settlements is they're not just islands. They're connected by highways. And the highways that connect them allow many of the settlers to experience life in a settlement as being nearly indistinguishable from life in Israel proper. Right? It's a lovely community. It sits atop a hill. Right? You've got the same power and internet as anybody else does. You can get in your car. You can drive into Tel Aviv to check a show. Get back in your car, drive home again, and it seems normal. It's not an issue at all. However, those highways frequently are inaccessible to Palestinians. And if those highways are carving up the territory and connecting these settlements, it makes it very, very difficult for Palestinians to move around the territory that's supposed to be technically theirs. The village of Kikilia up here, if you look in the north, next to where it says Kafar Saba, the village of Kikilia is a unique circumstance because the village of Kikilia was effectively right on the border with Israel, but to its east, both northeast and southeast, it had large areas where it produced olives. And olives are a major crop for this whole area. They are one of the primary agricultural elements. And it's important to know about olives that if you walk into your field and you plant an olive tree today, it's not giving you olives anytime soon. It may be a decade or more before you will be able to harvest olive fruit from that tree. The village of Kikilia is interesting because when erecting its security wall, the nation state of Israel effectively boxed in the village of Kikilia, creating a scenario in which Kikilia has a narrow access road that goes back into the rest of Palestine, And the olive orchards to the north and southeast have been walled away from it. They're no longer accessible. And what that did was eventually impoverish the people of Takitaki and force them to move along. This is, again, a calculated strategy. Now, it's certainly less violent, right, than going in with guns and forcing people to leave. But it is what we would define as conquest. And before we allow ourselves to kind of look on it with any particular normative sense, right, we have to look at the way the rest of the world has been founded, including our own country, right? This is a country that was founded by conquest. Settlers pushed Native Americans further and further west. They pushed them into reservations. They made deals and treaties with them, and they broke them. And today we have a politically contiguous United States of America. It's superpower of the world. But if you're a Native American, you've probably got a few bones to pick with how all that happened, right? And so when we get to this point in our understanding of the situation, we cannot lose sight of the idea that you have peoples in this scenario who are some completely innocent and want nothing but to get along with each other, some who are making calculations about the preservation of their religion or their culture and are willing to engage in some measure of political or maybe even military gamesmanship. And of course, you have those people whose hearts have been hardened, who no longer necessarily see the people on the other side of the line or the wall as people, or are simply willing to do what they think it will take to win. When we think about the politics in this, we have to remember that the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was actually removed from power not that long ago and made it back in by a very narrow margin in the Israeli Knesset. That his unity coalition has already allowed him to avoid many of the legal troubles that he was facing prior to October 7th, 2023. And that while Netanyahu himself has been a proponent of military retaliation and the settlement movement, there are those in his government who are even more hardline than he is. And so he finds himself in a very dicey political circumstance. Something like October 7th, which we'll get to here in just a few minutes, also tends to remove public support for moderate stances, right? Harken back to our own vote in the United States to take military action against Afghanistan in the aftermath of September 11th. There were only a few votes in opposition, and a lot of them caught a tremendous amount of political flack for it. The same happened in Israel after October 7th. Meanwhile, on the other side, Hamas has big legitimacy questions. Hamas was elected in the Gaza Strip in 2006 and has not faced any kind of election since. They haven't allowed for one. So how much legitimacy you have as a democratically elected governing force really comes under question, right? When it's been nearly 2 decades since the people had a chance to choose. Some question whether or not they can ever deliver on the right of return, if it's even realistic to try. It's also important for us to understand an element of Islamic romanticism. And I'm going to give you this in as quick a measure as I possibly can, but there are entire fields of study that approach this. And it essentially goes like this. If you understand the origins of things like the Muslim Brotherhood and many of the more fundamentalist Islamic organizations that emerge throughout the 1960s and continue to emerge until the modern era, one of the core themes of that is that the Muslim people have allowed themselves to become further and further and further from God. And that what is required for them to return to power, both political power and spiritual power, is a stricter, more fundamentalist interpretation of their religion. Now, the Islamic faith in and of itself has many different precepts that make religious interpretation more difficult than it is for other faiths. Depending on which particular branch of Islam you exist within, there can be either some number of rightly anointed caliphs that formerly had that power. That number can go between 5 and 12, depending on where you're kind of coming at it from. But what that means is that there's no one alive today who really has the spiritual authority to moderate the Quran or some of the more extreme interpretations that are contained within it. There's also a cycle throughout Islamic religious and political history that shows them getting punched in the mouth by world events and then returning to power and significance. The original tribes outside of Mecca and Medina immediately fought against their Arab neighbors and were overwhelmed. And then they stood up and they stood tall, and those people converted, and the first age of Islamic empires began. And if you look at the Umayyad caliphates and the Abbasid caliphates, even the Mongols, right? The Mongols come sweeping through middle of Asia, wiping out good chunks of Islamic empire and civilization. What happens? Time passes, the Mongols become the Mughals, and they all convert to Islam. Over and over and over again, they have these echoes in their history where, yes, we get overwhelmed, right? But we get back up. We are restored, and we get power back. And many of the Islamic scholars in the 1960s absolutely took that position. And for them, the way you got back was adopting a much more fundamentalist version of Islam. And so one of the answers amongst that part of the Islamic community to problems like this, right, where the West is ascendant and you are sometimes literally refugees, is we need to return to our spiritual roots. We need to return to the most strongest, perhaps most severe interpretation of our faith, and then fight against the infidels. And if that is the undercurrent behind some of your most dramatic and most influential religious scholars and speakers, it's going to put you in a position where things like negotiated truces or the surrender of land for peace, as we saw in '93 in Oslo, may not be successful. They may not be welcomed. Let's also not forget the idea that there are other players in this game. The United States of America puts a tremendous amount of military and political support into the nation state of Israel. We do so for a lot of reasons, right? But that support is tangible and incredibly important for Israel's defense. Iran backs Hamas, backs Hezbollah. They have their own reasons, just like we do, for supporting their proxy actors in this conflict, right? Lebanon itself, despite being a separate nation state, a lot of control there by Hezbollah, significant influence from Iran. Jordan, back and forth, obviously, between its various different allies. The Jordanian government's not necessarily something anybody would aspire to at this point, but there's also the tremendous number of long-term refugees existing within Jordan. Egypt has active security interests because they border up against the southern end of this. And when things happen in Gaza, people try to get across that border. And when Hamas is trying to move weapons in, sometimes they try to get them across that border as well. And then there's Russia. Russia has active interests, frequently not only with Jordan, but also with Iran, and sometimes opposing anything the United States is trying to do. One of the reasons why Russia, in the most recent round of armed conflicts in the Middle East, has been actively supporting both Iran and people like Hamas and Hezbollah is because they're hoping the United States will shift its military support to Israel from Ukraine. Because every dollar, every dime, every bit of political will or military asset that goes to help Israel is not helping Ukraine. And Russia has an active interest in not helping Ukraine. And so there's a lot of external political factors that factor in. And then, yes, we have to get to October 7th. We have to get to October 7th because October 7th was shocking in a way that cannot be adequately expressed for people, I think, who live outside of Israel. Most folks in Israel are cognizant of the threat. Most of them have had people in their families, all of them have been trained at least, serve within the IDF. Lost people to rocket attacks or suicide bombs. But the scale and the success of the attack of October 7th rocked the Israeli psyche. It's worth thinking about the idea that we know that there are at least 1,200 Israeli casualties. And the rough breakdown, as far as we understand it right now, is that somewhere on the order of 800 and change were civilian, and the remainder were IDF forces who were fighting against Hamas fighters as they came across. 252 hostages were taken, and those 800 civilians were killed in all sorts of different circumstances, including a music festival, some in their neighborhoods, some in their homes. Narratives came out after the fact about, people going after children specifically or going after babies. Hasn't been supported by the evidence, but it doesn't surprise anyone that an attack so brutally targeting civilians might target children. How many fighters were involved, whether or not some of the hostages were killed as caravans leaving Israel were struck by air assets. In many ways, doesn't matter. Some of that will always be lost to the fog of war. What is absolutely true is that this was a strike, largely targeting civilians, in which Hamas fighters killed a whole bunch of Israelis and shocked that nation. By proportion, I believe the math works out to this being something like 5 or 6 9/11s, if you look at the proportion of the population in comparison. It is a massive chunk. And just as people who were in and around 9/11 were recalling, people who they knew in the towers or people who narrowly escaped it, almost everyone knows someone 1, 2, 3 steps removed who died on October 7th. And Israel's response has been massive. And in some ways, that's part of what we're here to understand right now. Because Israel's response has been a pretty much full-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip. And the consequences of that invasion have brought us to a point in which we are dealing with a humanitarian crisis and a casualty count that no one realistically anticipated. I first gave a version of this talk over the summer. And at the time, in excess of 36,000 Gazan Palestinian civilians had died as a result of this. The number from yesterday was 43,680 civilians. These aren't Hamas fighters, these are civilians. 100,000 injured, 2.1 million and more displaced. I'm going to stop right here for a moment because I don't think anybody would stand here and go, you know what, 10/7 was justified. Just like we wouldn't say 9/11 was justified. Right? But let's think about what might drive someone to that point. We don't need to agree with them. We don't need to condone their actions. But if we are going to be social scientists, it helps us to understand, how do you get there? How do you get to the point where you would, go through a gateway, right? And go into somebody's house, shoot 1 or 2 of them and throw the other one in the back of a truck? I hope these things feel abhorrent. They feel distant. They feel like they're part of a video game narrative or something, right? It's something that we could never see ourselves doing. And there's an instinct, I think, when we hear about something like this, to think about it like, well, they're just bloodthirsty. They're crazy, right? But that's frequently not the case. Remember, I asked, what would you do to feel safe? What would you do to be safe? If you felt like your people were being systemically, procedurally annihilated and the world didn't care, when's your breaking point? Now, we all know somebody who would probably kind of be all bravado about it, right? Like, oh, you don't have to break point anything. You get it in my face, I'll be happy to, rawr, fight you. And there's some folks who are like, I don't think I'd ever fight. But a lot of people do eventually. Is it when you see your family drug off to a ghetto and eventually to a gas chamber? Does that militarize you? Does that radicalize you? What about when your grandma and grandpa die in the refugee camp because there's no medicine? And they tell you stories about the olive orchard you used to have that been taken from you. And they cry because this was going to be your inheritance, what they wanted to give back to you. And the reason they stayed in that refugee camp for 70 years was because they hoped someday those could be your trees. Told you this was hard. And so what we end up having is now an abhorrent action by an aggrieved people done in hopes of changing the outcome after a history of oppression. And that is met by an abhorrent action by an aggrieved people in hopes that it will change a history of oppression. You cannot condone in any real element of morality the actions of October 7th. You can't, right? You're attacking civilians. But you can understand it. And you cannot condone 43,000 civilian casualties in reprise. But you can understand it. People in Gaza feel like they are being suffocated, and systemically and procedurally by element of Israeli government policy, they are. They're being driven out. And they are lashing out in the only ways that they think they know how. Israel feels like things like October 7th can never happen again. If that means they need to clear Gaza to rubble, there are people there who are willing to do it. And that's a hard place to be. The world obviously reacts in different ways. People have sympathy for Israel. People have sympathy for Gaza. Students are protesting here and around the world about what's going on in this place. South Africa filed charges in the International Court of Justice, effectively saying that what Israel is doing is genocide. Israel denies it. They say they are simply defending themselves. But what I want to note is that when I first presented this information a few months ago, the scholars were largely split. Some people said, yes, this meets the technical definition of genocide. About an equal number said, no, this isn't what this is. As of this month, almost all of them are going, this meets the definition of genocide. Now, the International Court of Justice has no power to make Israel stop. But should it revise its initial interim rulings and say that this is a genocide, I mean, that will be a pretty significant international event. And let's also think about for a moment the difficulties of doing something like this, right? Because if you are Israel, well, let's presume that you have the best of intentions, that you're really just trying to target Hamas people, right? People who are actively orchestrating both the import of weapons and taking actions against you, or maybe even holding hostages. That's hard. Because this is what parts of South Gaza look like today. Previous, you had homes, you had installations, right? You had stuff. And after the events that happened in North Gaza, and after people have been displaced, this is what it looks like. People in tents and people in impromptu buildings and people just sleeping rough on the ground. Now, if there are 5 Hamas commanders and 3 weapon stashes in this area, what do you do about it? Now, there's a whole category of things you could do, right? You could do nothing and wait to try to catch them outside of this area. But then you risk that those Hamas fighters or those Hamas weapons get used against your troops or your people. You could send troops in, right? But that maybe is guaranteeing a massive battle. As well as the fact that it's not like the Hamas fighters are wearing big signs that say Hamas, right? They don't have little indicators above their heads like it's some kind of video game. Anyone could be a combatant. Anyone could be a non-combatant. How do you deal with it? And if you're the person who has to turn to the families of the IDF members that you might send in there to what could be an absolute ambush and go, I got your kids killed because I didn't want to throw a bomb down, you may find yourself in a position where you look at it and go, well, I can do a targeted airstrike at an area where I think I'm getting a satellite signal, right? And I'm not going to carpet bomb the whole thing, but I'm going to bomb this area, try to take out the Hamas militant, and there's going to be some casualties. I'm glad I don't have to make decisions like that. But that's the reality of war. This is the Gaza waterfront, before and after. This is what happens when an area that is known for its beaches and its vacation areas and its cool little food stands gets turned into a war zone. And when I return to the theme that this is not necessarily accidental, I want to emphasize that, right? Hamas has said things that give many people within Israel serious misgivings about the idea that they would ever accept something less than Israel's annihilation, right? From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Some people say that is a social kind of justice rallying cry, and other people say it's a threat to throw the Jewish people into the sea. We've heard death to Israel and death to America from Islamic radicals. And part of the functional Hamas charter says there will not be no concession on any inch of lands. Never recognize the legitimacy of Israeli occupation. We will free Jerusalem inch by inch, stone by stone. Israel has no right to be here. But on the flip side, listen to what the Israeli government, members within it, are saying. We are now rolling out that Gaza Nakba. Gaza Nakba 2023, that's how it will end. Understand that that is analogous to someone promising the Holocaust for the Palestinian people. Israel Heritage Committee, Amalai Elahi. Nuclear weapon is a possibility. President Herzog, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. And the education minister, those are animals, they have no right to exist. I'm not debating the way it will happen, but they need to be exterminated. Some of these quotes are being entered into the South African case for genocide. Kind of hard to argue against it, in their own words. So let's talk about the tactics, right? Is this terrorism, the civilian targeting terrorism, the suicide targeting bombing terrorism, it's rocket fire terrorism, hostage taking. Some historical scholars would say that, yes, this is absolutely terrorism, and others would go, it's also what asymmetric warfare looks like, right? You could levy that many of the actions taken by the American Revolutionary Army were technically violations of the rules of war, right? But we were undermanned. We fired from tree lines and sabotaged supply lines, right? By the regimented British rules of conflict in the late 1700s, that was dishonorable and unthinkable. But we were the asymmetric power in that case. We were completely overwhelmed. We did what we thought we had to do to win. Now, I think targeting civilians is a far stretch from firing at armed troops from a tree line, but the justification provided by a lot of people in this position is that that's what this looks like. On the flip side, Israel's targeting also seems to be dealing with civilians, right? 43,000 killed to date. Israel also has been accused of specifically targeting humanitarian aid efforts. That even when the aid trucks are painted with a great big aid symbol on the top of them and their routes have been communicated to the IDF, they get bombed anyway. And those who are accusing Israel of targeting them say that this is a way to dissuade other aid actors from coming into the region and to functionally starve out Palestinian people. Recent conversation has been about the general plan, which has been rumored as a discussed military strategy from Israeli right-wing and kind of hardline generals that essentially want to draw a line in northern Gaza and say anyone north of that line is a combatant. We're not going to bother trying to figure out whether they are or not. Some people think that the general plan is already being acted on. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another bit that has been very, very interesting is that on September 17th and 18th, Israel detonated a series of pagers and communications devices largely held by members of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, that is on one side a incredible victory of covert operations, and on the other side, many would consider it to be a war crime because they're indiscriminate objects that were detonated frequently among civilian populations. 42 people were killed, at least 12 of them were known civilians, and over 3,000 were injured. That's a unique kind of stratagem on the field of conflict. And if we're talking about tactics and targeting civilians or being unconcerned about the indiscriminate nature of your explosives, there's an argument to say that that's problematic. And then, of course, all of this brings us to the humanitarian outcomes. Joyce Musa, who is the acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, says that there is really no safe place in Gaza for people to go to. That food was cut off for weeks and regularly is cut off for weeks. And that, as stated here, the level of suffering in Gaza defies our ability to capture it in words or even comprehend its scale. And I don't mean to be too depressing, but that's unavoidable in this particular instance. It's also getting worse. Because previously the West Bank, which has always seen some measure of conflict, right, was not part of this, but operations are escalating within it. Since October 7, 2023, additional 700 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces there. And the settlers in the West Bank, many of whom are aggrieved by October 7th, but it's worth noting that many of the settlers who have moved into the West Bank tend to be the most extreme hardline individuals within the Israeli population. Settler violence has increased significantly. It's not uncommon for a group of settlers to go to a Palestinian home and essentially set it on fire, because that will remove the Palestinians from the area. And then once the fire dies down, they clear out the rubble and somebody else builds a house there from the settler community. 23 Israelis were killed in the West Bank, some IDF, some settlers. Another 16 Israelis were killed when West Bank armed Palestinians basically tried to fight into Israel and do harm there as well. But about 1,800 Palestinian structures have been destroyed. Homes, businesses, schools in the West Bank since October 7th. Lebanon, to the north, is also escalating. There have been about 1,900 attacks in various different configurations from Lebanon, about 8,300 attacks from Israel. It's over 564 dead in Lebanon as of right now. On July 31st, Israel assassinates a Hezbollah commander, Fawad Shakur. September 23rd, they began airstrikes in Lebanon. September 27th, they assassinated the leader of Hezbollah. And October 1st, they began a ground invasion of Lebanon proper. In Iran, on April 1st, Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Iran countered by seizing a ship and launching strikes inside Israel. Israel countered by striking Iran and Syria, and then it kind of calmed down for a few months. Both sides seemed to project that they wanted to have a reprisal, but they didn't want to escalate the conflict. But then on July 31st, in basically the same area or the same set of attacks where they assassinated the Hezbollah commander, they successfully assassinated the leader of Hamas. And that sparked up a whole new round between Iran and Israel. On October 1st, Iran struck Israel with missiles and drones. And just the other day, on the 25th, Israel struck Iran back. Again, mentioned it previously, the elements of the general plan: ordered evacuation from all of northern Gaza, complete restriction of aid, and any individuals remaining within the territory will be considered enemy combatants. This is generally considered a siege and in violation of most of the rules of war. It's one of the reasons why Israel is not publicly saying that they're doing it. People on the ground say they think it's happening. I cannot give an authoritative yes or no. Now, what happens next? First off, that should be October 2023. That's a misprint there, right? Since October 2023, the United States has provided over $17 billion in combined aid to Israel. Those dollars have been used to further its military campaigns, to enforce and reinforce and rearm things like its Iron Dome. But one of the questions will be, what does that effort look like in a few months? Because Americans will make a major decision about it exactly 1 week from today, right? Donald Trump's on the record of telling Benjamin Netanyahu to do what you have to do, says he's doing a good job, but that Joe Biden is holding him back. Donald Trump praised the pager attack. He thought it was cool. Kamala Harris says that Israel has a right to self-defense. She's been on the record as having supported Israel and its territorial integrity, but has also declared that Palestine is a humanitarian crisis. It's devastating. She's called for a ceasefire and emphasizes Palestinian dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. It is unlikely that a new Harris administration would reverse the entirety of its support for Israel. It may do as the Biden administration has done, an attempt to hold Benjamin Netanyahu to certain standards. Whether or not an outside actor can do that at this point is debatable. It's questionable. She did refuse to meet with Netanyahu personally when he visited the United States, suggesting that she is taking a harder line stance than Biden is. And all of these comments do have to be interpreted through the lens of the American election, right? If she was strongly in favor of Israel, she wouldn't want to risk certain pro-Palestinian votes by condemning that more specifically. If she was strongly in favor of Palestine, she wouldn't want to risk pro-Israeli votes by coming out too strongly on that side. I think that she's threading a needle here, and it's hard to read exactly where she's at. Former President Trump seems to be pretty content with the idea of empowering Netanyahu to do what he's doing. It's also worth noting that former President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in a very, very blatant sign to the Palestinian people that he did not respect their claims to that city. Now, relevant for today, because if we're trying to figure out what this is actually doing or what's going on, yesterday morning, the Israeli parliament passed a measure essentially outlawing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees from operating within the state of Israel. This essentially will expel all UN members from the state of Israel who are part of this agency and prevent any Israeli territory from being used to deliver humanitarian aid to Palestine. have difficulty classifying this. Now, you could make an argument that says that these aid efforts still potentially could be used to smuggle arms or contraband into the territory, and that's a security risk. That hasn't proven true thus far right now, but you could argue that point. You could also argue that if you are looking at the strategy of Israel being to effectively conquer this territory by displacing, destroying, and reducing the ability for Palestinians to live there or inhabit it, this seems to fall in line with that strategy. It was also announced by the United Nations that there are 345,000 individuals estimated within the territory of Gaza who meet what is the IPDC level 5 categorization for starvation and humanitarian crisis. Level 5 is considered catastrophic. At level 5, they presume people are dying of hunger daily. So the United Nations says that's what's going on. Lastly, this morning, statement from the Israeli Defense Force was that the IDF is conducting targeted operations and making efforts to avoid causing harm to the uninvolved civilians. We emphasize that the area was evacuated by the IDF. It is currently an active combat zone. That said, that is the housing development that was standing as of Tuesday morning that is no longer standing. 93 Palestinians were killed in that, including at least 12 women and 20 children. Some of those children were babies. 17 people are missing. 60 additional people were killed this morning in airstrikes in both Gaza and Lebanon. So, understanding this conflict, understanding its consequence, understanding its gravity is hard, right? It is made in some ways harder by the fact that we stand in our comfort and security in a nation that in many ways was made safe and rich by conquest. It's part of our privilege. And yet, nothing can condone October 7th, just like nothing can condone 9/11. Nothing can condone the Holocaust. You can decide for yourself whether or not this, which again, we're a couple of arguments in an International Court of Justice deliberation away from being classified as a genocide, is also an excuse. Are there people involved in this conflict who are monsters? Yes, there are. People who, through their own suffering and watching friends get blown up, or listening to family members tell stories about how things used to be and then looking around at a comparative hellscape of what they are now, will be willing to kill and hurt others, innocents, who have been robbed of that element of humanity. And as much as those people are a danger, that is also part of this tragedy. That grinding oppression, inhumanity, and suffering can bleach the humanity out of people. And there are innocent people. And there are military actors who are actually doing their best to try to minimize the casualties while winning the war and bringing peace. And there are military generals for whom the elimination of the enemy, including the civilians, is a desirable outcome. And if you then take this modern struggle, horror, catastrophe, and you place it back into the context, back into the history, and back into the complexity, you begin to understand why this is so hard. Now, I cannot give you a sunny leave off for this, right? I can't be like, and then we can finish up by doing this one thing and it'll all be okay again. That would be disingenuous, right? In many ways, I owe it to you as an educator, as a fellow citizen, to leave you close to this point, appreciating the complexity and the difficulty and the tragedy of it. But on top of that, I do want to leave you with one positive point. And that is this. There is no action, there is no predestination that says this cannot improve. Will it require getting past some of those hardened hearts? Yes. Will it require listening, perhaps, to other people? Making sacrifices? Yes. Not that long ago, Hamas actually put out a statement saying that despite the fact they weren't going against anything in that Hamas Foundation document that's like, oh, every stone, right? They said that a resolution not unlike the 1967 borders, right, would be a good step towards resolving the conflict. They signaled an acceptance for something like that, right? And people's minds are changing. One of the reasons why this has become such a major element is that this is the first time in my adult life that sympathy for what's happening to the Palestinians, which has been happening to the Palestinians for a long time, has emerged in the United States to this scope. I've been teaching about this for better than, 15 years now. All right? I used to ask my students, what do you know about this? And they would repeat what had been the dominant element within the media. You know, Israel is like us and they're the good guys and everybody else is terrorists. That was the conception. And there's a lot of Israel that is good guys. And there are some Palestinians or members of that group that are terrorists. But the fact that we are able to see it with complexity now, the fact that we are able to see it with humanity, the fact that we are not buying into any one particular narrative, the fact that we are seeing it for exactly what it is, and we are beginning to appreciate how hard it is actually the first step to doing something about it. To supporting actions from our own country and our own administration and through various different non-governmental organizations that can put leverage on the situation. That can begin to empower more moderating factions within both sides. That can call attention to the genocide, if you want to call it that. And that can potentially change things. You cannot approach a problem successfully until you understand it. And while I wish I could give you the keys to the kingdom and let you leave from this place tonight and solve this by tomorrow, I ain't got them. But I can help you understand the problem. And pretty much all of you will likely outlive me by a factor of 20 years of youth. And I'm going to need you to take that understanding and do something about it. So that maybe by the time one of you, and I'm counting on somebody here becoming a political scientist, right? So somebody, don't let me down. By the time one of you is sitting where I'm sitting and giving another presentation, you don't have to end it here. You can talk about how the world came together and changed. Because while things are dark, that is absolutely possible. And now, thank you for your kind attention. I will open it up to some questions. If there are any, if your desire is to go off somewhere and look at CAD videos online, I understand. That's what I'm going to do after this. Yes, sir, Dieter.
Thank you so much. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
With this closing and your optimism, can you give us an example where a problem like this has been solved in history?
Short answer, Northern Ireland, right? That's the first one that comes to mind. Deeply, deeply entrenched and angry divisions that over years of coming to points of understanding, de-escalated. Is it perfect? No, right? But the age of militarism, explosives, and reprisal attacks is largely over, right? We've seen that happen. We've seen it change. And that's the first one that comes to mind. I mean, there have been other things like this, elements of asymmetrical conflict, in which the elimination of one side was not necessary for there to be some arrival at peace. I mean, it is largely more a diplomatic effort, but you could argue that elements within South Africa itself, right? One of the reasons they're so well tuned to genocide is that this could have erupted after the fall of the apartheid regime in '94. Something like this could have been the next thing, right? But they steered out of that. And again, not perfect today, but something like the kind of rage and violence and deep-seated animosity that we see here and that we saw in Northern Ireland, it certainly has been present in South Africa. But it required something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a whole process to circumvent it. So maybe if Northern Ireland is the example of where it gets bad and gets better, maybe South Africa is what happens when you're aware it could get bad and you're steering around what could be bad. And both of those, I think, give us hope for what this could be, because all of them involve people being honest about the tragedy, right? That's the whole point of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, being honest about the tragedy and trying to move forward together towards something better rather than engaging in cycles of, retribution and violence. Now, just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's going to require some people to accept in a scenario like this that justice might not look like what they want, right? Justice might not look like what they want. But doesn't mean it's not some measure of justice, and it doesn't mean it's not significantly better than whatever it is continuing. Thank you. Yes, sir.
With it just being over a year since October 7th and Hamas giving a statement about the chance of there being some sort of truce, do you think we're still on more of an incline or more on a decline?
So I think that it's important to remember that just like the Israeli government exists of a Knesset and, obviously a prime minister and has lots of complications, that Hamas also has lots of complications, right? In the Gaza Strip, Hamas is not a pure single unified body. There's a political arm, there's a military arm. They're obviously, as of this point in time, very, very scattered. It's not like they're getting together for meetings at Hamas HQ, right? That's not what's going on. So I do believe there are members of Hamas who would be more than willing to come to the table and try to make some kind of a peace settlement. I don't know how many of them are willing to sacrifice the core elements of their ideology to do so, even if that means more of this and or death, right? I don't know to what extent the same path is open in Israel the way politics are currently balancing out. Because of what's happening and because of the disposition within the Knesset and because of the corner that in many ways Netanyahu finds himself in, I'm concerned that anything short of clearing Gaza might create enough of a backlash from his right-wingers that he might be removed from power. Now, I don't know that. I know that the moderates in the Knesset have not been particularly successful at restraining anything he's doing. They've not been particularly successful at rallying kind of public support against him to stop him from what he's doing. And he himself is in a position where if he loses power, it's entirely possible, depending on who gains it, that his own legal issues could reemerge and land him in prison. And so if he is in a position where there are a whole selection of hardliners that go, now's your time, right? We can end this once and for all. We're going to clear Gaza. Maybe we're going to go on and clear the West Bank. And it's going to be done, right? If that's the sentiment of the hardliners on his right, and if he opposes them in that goal, it could cause his political downfall, which could then cause his imprisonment. He doesn't have a whole lot of incentives not to do it. And externally, right, there are not a whole lot of international actors who have been willing to really come down on him hard, including our own president, right? Now, one of the reasons that, according to Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden himself, one of the reasons they have not, been harsher in that is they understand that if they basically tell Netanyahu to change his plan, he's just cutting off communication, right? And even if at this point in time, if we were to cut off our aid or restrict it, provided we could get that through Congress at this point, right? Which is doubtful. But even if we could, he doesn't necessarily need us for this stretch, right? He could accomplish this goal probably without an additional dime of US dollars. And since we're not going to actively oppose him, it's not like we're going to, the UN's not going to be able to put in peacekeepers or anything like that. There's not a lot of leverage there unless you're at the table next to him. Now, some people think that that's a weak position, right? And that he should have, the American government should have made a much more robust statement in support of Palestine and should have cut off that aid much earlier in this conflict, if not years ago, right? But there are also all of those elements of political reality that are true here domestically as well as anywhere else. And so, yeah, I right now I am concerned. If we were talking about in terms of game theoretics, there's concern that peace for Israel is, for a lot of reasons, a dominated strategy, and that continuing this conflict and pushing and essentially conquering Gaza is the dominant strategy, and that unless something can change the payoffs, that's going to be the way it is. There's no reason to not do it, and I don't know that we have a way to change those payoffs. That's my concern. Any other questions? We are at almost exactly 7:33. And since we started at like 6:03, that was the 90 minutes I promised you. So again, it's heavy. I get it, right? The other thing I want to give you is that while it is heavy and occasionally depressing and hard, it's real, right? This is not sugar-coated for you as college students. I would give this exact same presentation to a group of scholars or a group of wannabe employees of the diplomatic corps or a group of soldiers. Right? This is as much reality as I can provide to you. And this is the adult stuff. But you can build from this. Hopefully we all can. Thank you again for your kind attention. You are dismissed to go.